Today's story takes us back to the year 1859 and follows the life of Seraphina Drake, an enslaved black girl whose beauty became a curse instead of a blessing. The mistress could not tolerate the attention Seraphina attracted, and what she chose to do next went far beyond cruelty. She kept the child chained and hidden away for 10 long years. This is a painful and intense story, so take a moment, breathe slowly, and listen carefully. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city and country you are listening from. Your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive rather than buried in silence. Let us begin in the spring of 1859, inside a small wooden cabin behind the Whitmore Plantation in Warren County, Mississippi. A baby girl was born with eyes the color of amber and skin that seemed to glow even under the weak light of a single candle. Her mother, a field slave named Ruth, looked down at her newborn child and felt something she had rarely felt in her 32 years of bondage. She felt fear, not the familiar fear of the overseer's whip or the master's anger, but a deeper and heavier fear. Ruth knew, with the instinct only a mother possesses, that her daughter's rare beauty would one day become either her protection or her destruction. She named the baby Seraphina, after the highest order of angels. It was a word she had once heard the plantation mistress read aloud from a book of religious poetry many years earlier. Ruth could not read or write, but she never forgot that word. Seraphina, the burning ones, the angels closest to God. She whispered the name into her daughter's ear that very first night, praying that heaven might guard what she herself could not protect. The Whitmore Plantation stretched across 1,800 acres of some of the richest cotton land in the Mississippi Delta. The main house stood on a gentle rise, overlooking the fields, a 2-story Greek Revival mansion with tall white columns and wide verandas. Its beauty mocked the suffering that paid for every brick and board. In 1859, the plantation held 147 enslaved people and produced nearly 500 bales of cotton each year, making the Whitmore family one of the wealthiest in the region. The master of the house was Colonel James Whitmore, a 63-year-old man known for running what he proudly called a tight operation. He rarely stepped into the slave quarters, leaving daily control to overseers and to his wife. James Whitmore spent most of his time in Vicksburg, handling business affairs and attending political gatherings. He served 2 terms in the Mississippi state legislature and considered himself a gentleman of the highest class. He owned human beings as casually as he owned furniture or horses, never once questioning the system that had made him rich. The true authority within the Whitmore household, however, did not belong to the colonel. It belonged to his wife, Helena Whitmore. She was 41 years old in 1859, a woman who had once been praised as the most beautiful debutante in Natchez society. Time, disappointment, and bitterness had hardened her face and darkened her heart. She had given her husband 3 sons, all of whom survived to adulthood, and she believed this was her greatest success. Yet Helena lived with a quiet rage that shaped everything she did. She knew her beauty was fading. She saw it each morning in the mirror, in the fine lines around her eyes and the soft sag of her jaw, and she hated it. Helena ruled the domestic slaves with absolute control. She personally supervised the cooks, laundresses, house servants, and nursemaids. Nothing escaped her notice. She believed deeply in what she called proper order, which meant complete obedience from every enslaved person under her roof. The field slaves answered to the overseers. The house slaves answered to Helena, and Helena answered to no one at all. For the first 7 years of her life, Seraphina lived mostly unseen. She stayed close to her mother in the small cabin behind the main house, where Ruth worked as a laundress. The labor was exhausting and cruel. Ruth spent 14 hours each day washing, boiling, and pressing the Whitmore family's fine linens and clothing. Her hands were permanently burned and scarred by lye soap and boiling water. Still, she kept her daughter near her side, teaching her to stay quiet, stay unnoticed, and most importantly, stay alive. Seraphina learned quickly. She helped carry water from the well and sort piles of dirty laundry. She learned to fold sheets so perfectly that not a single wrinkle remained. She learned to walk softly, to speak only when spoken to, and never to look a white person directly in the eyes. These were the rules of survival every enslaved child learned long before they understood why. There was one thing Ruth could never teach her daughter to hide. She could not dull the light that seemed to shine from Seraphina's face. By the time the girl turned 7, her beauty could no longer be ignored. Her amber eyes appeared to change color with the light, shifting from deep gold to warm honey brown. Her features were perfectly balanced, almost unnaturally so, with high cheekbones and a soft, delicate chin. Her skin was flawless, a deep brown that seemed warm even in the coldest months. And when she smiled, which was rare, it stopped people in their tracks. The other enslaved people noticed first. They whispered among themselves, some in admiration and others in fear. Old Bessie, who worked in the kitchen and claimed she had the gift of sight, warned Ruth to keep the child hidden. She said that beauty like that only brought pain. Men would desire her, and women would resent her. Either way, she said, it always ended in blood. Ruth tried her best. She kept Seraphina inside the cabin whenever possible. She dressed her in plain, loose clothing and rubbed dirt across her face. She wrapped her hair tightly beneath rough cloth. But beauty like Seraphina's could not be hidden. It pushed through everything, just like sunlight breaking through clouds. The day everything changed came in September of 1859. The summer heat had finally eased, and Helena Whitmore decided to walk through the domestic work areas for one of her surprise inspections. She did this often, appearing without warning to criticize the enslaved workers and remind them of their place. That afternoon, she passed the laundry area just as Seraphina stepped out of the cabin carrying a heavy basket of freshly folded linens. The girl did not see the mistress approaching. She was focused on balancing the load, careful not to drop the neatly pressed sheets. The cloth covering her head had slipped, and her hair, which Ruth had worked so hard to hide, fell in soft waves around her face. The afternoon sun struck her at just the right angle, lighting her features with a golden glow. Helena Whitmore stopped walking. She stood perfectly still, staring at the child for several long seconds. The expression on her face was not simple anger. It was something deeper and far more dangerous. It was the look of a woman facing something she could not accept. Ruth saw the mistress and felt her blood turn to ice. She dropped the shirt she was wringing and rushed toward her daughter. But it was too late. Helena had already seen her. And once Helena saw Seraphina, she could never forget her. That night, Helena lay awake in her canopied bed, staring at the ceiling while her husband slept beside her. She could not stop thinking about the slave girl. She could not stop comparing. When she closed her eyes, she saw those amber eyes and flawless skin, and a fierce rage grew inside her, one that frightened even her own heart. How dare this child, this piece of property, possess what Helena was losing? How dare she exist at all? By morning, Helena had made her decision. She told herself it was about discipline. She told herself it was about maintaining order. She told herself the girl had been disrespectful. None of it was true, but she repeated the lies until they felt real. The truth, which she would never admit even to herself, was much simpler. She could not bear to look at Seraphina, and if she could not destroy the girl's beauty, she would hide it where no one would ever see it again. The cellar beneath the Whitmore mansion had been used for storage since the house was built in 1841. It was a large space, nearly 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with stone walls and a dirt floor. One section had been turned into a wine cellar for the Connells' imported French wines. The back portion remained unused, dark, damp, and avoided even by the house servants. This was where Helena decided the girl would be kept. She gave the order to the overseer, a man named Thomas Crenshaw, and he carried it out without question. He was paid well not to ask why. That evening, after the Connell retired to his study with a glass of brandy, 2 domestic slaves came to Ruth's cabin under Crenshaw's supervision. They took Seraphina while Ruth screamed and begged. They dragged the child across the yard and into the main house through the back entrance. They carried her down the wooden stairs into the cellar and chained her to an iron ring bolted deep into the stone wall. Ruth tried to follow. She fought the hands holding her back, scratching and biting like a desperate animal. Crenshaw struck her across the face with the back of his hand, sending her to the ground. He warned her that if she spoke a single word about what had happened, She would be sold to traders and would never see this place again, never know what became of her daughter. Ruth understood. She understood that she was completely powerless. She understood that her daughter had been swallowed by the ground itself. She also understood that there was nothing she could do to stop it or undo it. The first night inside the cellar, Seraphina could not understand what was happening to her. She cried out for her mother until her throat burned and her voice disappeared. She tugged at the iron chain locked around her ankle until the metal sliced into her skin and blood ran slowly down her foot. She shouted for help again and again, but her cries could not pass through the thick stone walls or the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs. No one answered. No one ever would. The cellar was almost entirely dark. A small window, no larger than a man's hand, was set high on the wall near the ceiling. During the afternoon, it allowed a thin line of light to enter, just enough to tell day from night. But most of the time, Seraphina lived in complete darkness. She could not see her hands in front of her face. She could not see the walls that trapped her. All she could feel was the freezing stone beneath her body and the heavy pull of the chain on her leg. Helena created a strict routine that would last for the next 10 years. Twice every day, a kitchen slave carried a bowl of food down to the cellar. In the morning, it was usually cold cornmeal mush. In the evening, it was whatever leftovers remained from the family's supper. The slave was strictly forbidden to speak to Seraphina. They were not allowed to bring a candle or lantern. They were not allowed to tell anyone that a girl was being kept below the house. Helena made it very clear that breaking any of these rules would result in immediate sale to slave traders who passed through Vicksburg often. For the first several months, Seraphina screamed every time the cellar door opened. She begged to be let out. She promised to behave, to stay quiet, to disappear if that was what they wanted. But the slaves who brought the food could not help her, even if their hearts wanted to. They were trapped just like she was, locked inside a system that gave them no power and no choice. They set down the food and left, and Seraphina was left alone again in the dark. Time lost all meaning in the cellar. Without the steady pattern of sunlight and nightfall, without work to guide her hours, Seraphina forgot how long she had been imprisoned. Days melted into weeks. Weeks faded into months. She slept when her body gave in. She ate when food appeared. She cried until there were no tears left to shed. And then, slowly, something inside her began to shift. The human mind can change itself to survive. Faced with conditions that should have broken her completely, Seraphina's mind found ways to stay alive. She began to create order from emptiness. She counted her breaths in groups of 100. She repeated every word her mother had ever spoken, replaying conversations again and again in her head until they felt real. She traced shapes on the stone floor with her fingers, memorizing them in the darkness. She invented games, stories, and entire worlds that existed only in her imagination. But the most important skill Seraphina learned was how to listen. The cellar was directly beneath the main floor of the Whitmore mansion. The thick stone walls blocked most sound, but the wooden floor above allowed certain noises to pass through. When she pressed her ear to the wall in just the right place, she could hear voices from above. At first, the sounds meant nothing, just dull vibrations. But as time passed and her senses sharpened to replace her sight, she began to hear words, then sentences, then full conversations. She heard everything that happened in the Whitmore house. She heard the colonel arguing with business partners about debts and falling cotton prices. She heard Helena yelling at house slaves for mistakes that were not real. She heard the 3 Whitmore sons sharing their plans and secrets when they believed no one could hear them. She heard guests come and go. She heard whispered confessions and loud accusations. The house above her slowly gave up all its secrets, and Seraphina remembered every one of them. By her second year in the cellar, Seraphina had built a complete mental record of the Whitmore family's deepest secrets. She knew the colonel had borrowed large sums from a New Orleans bank to cover gambling debts he hid from his wife. She knew the oldest son, William, had fathered a child with a free black woman in Vicksburg and paid her to stay silent. She knew the middle son, Robert, had stolen silver from the family and sold it to pay for his drinking. She knew the youngest son, Thomas Jr., feared his mother deeply, and cried alone at night. She also knew dark truths about Helena. She knew Helena had once pushed a house slave down the stairs, causing the woman to lose her unborn child, and had convinced everyone it was an accident. She knew Helena stole money from household accounts and hid it in a private fund unknown to her husband. She knew Helena had forged a letter years earlier to destroy her own sister's engagement, a secret kept for 20 years. This knowledge became Serafina's greatest treasure. In the darkness, where she owned nothing else, she held power. Not the power to escape yet, but the power of knowing, the power of waiting, the power of understanding her enemies better than they understood themselves. The years passed painfully slowly. Serafina grew from a little girl into a young woman inside that cellar. Her body adjusted to the small space as best it could. The chain left a permanent scar around her ankle, a thick ring of damaged skin she would carry forever. Her muscles weakened from lack of movement. Her skin, once warm brown, turned pale and dull from never touching sunlight. Her amber eyes changed, learning to see in near total darkness like an underground creature. But her mind became stronger. With nothing outside to distract her, she turned inward. Her memory grew so sharp that she could recall conversations word for word even years later. She taught herself to think clearly, to organize information, to connect small details into larger truths. She played games of strategy in her mind, planning and counter-planning endlessly. Without realizing it, she was becoming something the Whitmore family never imagined. She was becoming dangerous. Her mother, Ruth, tried to reach her. For the first 3 years of Serafina's captivity, Ruth bribed a kitchen slave to whisper messages during food deliveries. The messages were short but powerful. "Your mama loves you. Stay strong, I am still here." Those words kept Serafina alive inside. Then, in the winter of 1862, the messages stopped. Serafina waited for weeks, then months, listening desperately. Finally, she learned the truth through a conversation between Helena and the housekeeper. Ruth was dead. Pneumonia. They said she worked through a fever, too afraid to rest, until her lungs filled with fluid. She was buried behind the cotton fields in an unmarked grave. Serafina did not cry. Her tears had dried up long ago. Instead, something new formed inside her, cold, solid, and patient, like a diamond under crushing pressure. It was hatred, not fast and fiery, but slow and enduring. The kind of hatred that waits, the kind that plans, the kind that never forgets. And now she knew her purpose. The war had already begun. Serafina heard everything through the floor above. In April 1861, Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter, and the South celebrated. The Whitmore house filled with pride and speeches. The colonel spoke of honor and states' rights. The sons argued over who would enlist first. Helena led sewing circles for uniforms. They believed the war would be quick and glorious. Serafina knew better. She heard the colonel's private worries, the doubts about blockades, foreign support, and fighting a stronger enemy. By 1862, the truth of war reached even the plantation. Cotton prices fell. William returned wounded from Tennessee, his stories silencing the table. Supplies grew scarce. Overseers left for war, replaced by boys and old men. The enslaved sensed change. The world was cracking. And in the cellar, Serafina waited. 5 years in darkness had taught her the greatest lesson of all. Patience was power, silence was strength, and the things people tried to bury always found a way to rise again. She was 17 years old. She had not felt real sunlight on her skin since she was 7. She had not heard a gentle or loving word since the day her mother died. She had no clear reason to believe her life would ever improve. Still, deep inside her, beyond logic or proof, she carried a strong certainty that her time would arrive. She felt it as truth, not hope. Above her, the house was slowly falling apart. She could hear it in every anxious discussion, every bitter argument, every whispered and desperate prayer. The Whitmore family was running out of money, running out of friends, and running out of time. The world that had once given them power and wealth was breaking down, and they were too proud and blind to notice. Serafina, thrown into the darkness beneath them, saw clearly. In that darkness she understood everything, and she was ready. The spring of 1864 brought changes that Serafina followed by sound alone. The voices above her became sharper and more fearful. She heard Helena arguing with the colonel about selling pieces of their land to pay debts. She heard William. healed from his wound but permanently weakened, speaking quietly with his brothers about the chance of losing the war. She heard the servants walking with less care, their voices freer when they believed the family could not hear them. Something was shifting, everyone felt it. Power was slipping away, food deliveries became irregular. Some days passed with nothing at all brought down to her. She learned to make tiny portions last, forcing herself to ignore the constant ache of hunger that never left her body. Her frame adjusted to near starvation, becoming thin and tight, needing very little to stay alive. This was not strength or resilience, it was the body's last defense against death. Still, it allowed her to survive when others would have failed. In November of 1864, she heard the name Sherman spoken in fear through the floorboards. A Union general named William Sherman was tearing through Georgia, burning towns and fields as his army marched from Atlanta toward the sea. The fear in Helena's voice was clear and sharp. If Sherman turned north into Mississippi, if his army reached Warren County, everything the Whitmores owned would vanish. Seraphina listened to that fear, and for the first time in 7 years she smiled in the dark. The winter of 1864 and 1865 was the hardest the plantation had ever known. The Confederate economy had completely collapsed. The paper money the family had saved meant almost nothing. Most of the enslaved people had fled, moving toward Union lines or disappearing into the chaos. The overseers were gone. The fields lay silent and abandoned, cotton rotting where it stood because no one was left to harvest it. Helena cut the household staff down to 3 enslaved people who had nowhere else to go. She dismissed the cook and took over the kitchen herself, something she had never done in her sheltered life. Meals became plain and scarce. The wine cellar was emptied and sold. The silver was pawned one piece at a time just to buy basic supplies. The great house, once proud and polished, began to decay. Paint peeled from the columns. Shutters hung crooked and loose. The gardens filled with weeds. Through all of it, Seraphina remained locked in her underground prison. Helena seemed to have forgotten her completely, too focused on the disaster unfolding above to remember the girl she had buried alive years earlier. Food came even less often. Sometimes 3 or 4 days passed without the cellar door opening. Seraphina survived on rainwater that dripped through a tiny window, and on rats she caught with her bare hands in the darkness. She became something both less than human and more than human at once, reduced to pure will and sharp purpose. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The war ended. The Confederacy was finished. Beneath the Whitmore mansion, a young woman who had been imprisoned for nearly 6 years heard the news through the floorboards and knew her moment was finally drawing near. The weeks after the surrender brought confusion and panic to Warren County, Mississippi. Union soldiers moved through the area, enforcing the terms of defeat and telling enslaved people they were free. Plantation owners who once ruled without question now watched their world collapse. Some ran away. Some ended their own lives rather than accept what had happened. Others, like the Whitmores, refused to believe it was real. Helena Whitmore continued to command her household as if nothing had changed. She spoke to the remaining servants with the same sharp authority she always had. She called the situation temporary, a small setback that would soon be corrected. Her denial was so deep it bordered on madness. The colonel, broken by loss, locked himself in his study and drank until he passed out every day. The sons scattered. William went to Vicksburg to see if anything could be saved. Robert vanished entirely, fleeing gambling debts from the war. Thomas Jr., the youngest, stayed behind, too afraid to leave and too weak to matter. And in the cellar, Seraphina waited. She had waited nearly 6 years. Waiting a little longer meant nothing. The moment came on a warm evening in late May. Seraphina listened as she always did, tracking footsteps and sounds. She heard Helena retire for the night. She heard the colonel's drunken snores. She heard Thomas Jr. pacing restless and fearful. Then she heard something new. The cellar door opened at a strange hour. Someone descended the steps holding a candle. The weak light felt blinding to Seraphina's eyes, trained to darkness. She pressed herself against the wall and covered her face. For a moment, she believed Helena had come to kill her, to erase the last proof of her crime. But the voice was not Helena's. It belonged to Bessie, an old woman who had once worked in the kitchen, the same woman who had warned Ruth about Seraphina's beauty long ago. Bessie was 73 now, too old and frail to run when others escaped, but she had never forgotten the girl below the house. With the old world falling apart, she had finally chosen to act. "Girl," Bessie whispered, her voice shaking, "the war is over, you are free. Do you hear me? You are free." Seraphina lowered her hands slowly. She had not seen a human face in nearly 6 years. Bessie's lined face, glowing in candlelight, felt unreal. Bessie brought tools, a hammer and a chisel, stolen and hidden for days. She knelt and worked at the iron ring, holding the chain. Rust had weakened it. After nearly an hour, the metal finally broke. Seraphina stood for the first time in years. Her legs shook violently. Her muscles were weak from years of stillness. She leaned against the wall, gasping, overwhelmed by the feeling of standing. Bessie helped her climb the stairs, step by painful step. The cellar door opened into a dark hallway near the kitchen. Compared to the cellar, it seemed filled with light. Seraphina blinked as tears streamed down her face. "You must go," Bessie said. "Union soldiers are in Vicksburg. They will help you." Seraphina did not move. She turned and looked toward the main rooms where the family slept. Her face was hollow and pale, but her amber eyes burned with quiet fire. "No," she said softly. "Not yet." Bessie begged her to leave, warned her of danger, told her Helena would kill her. But Seraphina had not survived by being careful. She had survived by changing. She told Bessie to return to her cabin and act as if nothing had happened. "You did not see me," she said. "You know nothing." Bessie understood. She had seen that look before in those who no longer feared their masters. Whatever Seraphina had become in the dark, she was no longer a victim. She was something far more dangerous. That night, while the candle burned low and the house slept, the quiet before what was coming finally settled in. While the Whitmore family slept, Seraphina moved through the house she had only ever known through sound and vibration. She walked quietly along the hallways, her bare feet silent against the wooden floors. The shape of the house matched perfectly with the map she had built in her mind over many years of listening to footsteps, voices and doors opening and closing above her. She knew which boards would creak if stepped on. She knew which doors groaned softly on their hinges. She knew where each person slept and the exact hours they usually woke. Nothing about the house surprised her. She made her way to Helena's private office on the second floor, a small room where the mistress kept her personal letters, records, and papers. The door was locked, but the lock was old and poorly cared for. Seraphina worked on it carefully with a hairpin she had taken from a dresser. No one had ever taught her how to pick a lock, but years of isolation had sharpened her instincts. Within minutes, the lock gave way with a soft click. Inside, the office looked just as she had imagined. A small writing desk sat near the window. A cabinet rested against the wall. Papers and ledgers were stacked neatly, arranged with Helena's usual rigid order. Seraphina moved slowly and carefully through the room, studying each document by the thin moonlight that slipped through the window. Her eyes, long used to darkness, had no trouble reading the words. She found everything she had hoped to find and more. She uncovered altered household accounts that proved Helena had been stealing from her husband for years. She found letters describing the cover-up of the enslaved woman's death on the stairs. She found correspondence with lawyers in New Orleans that revealed the true depth of the Whitmore family's debts, far worse than even the colonel suspected. Then she discovered something completely unexpected. There was a letter from a doctor in Natchez dated 1858. It confirmed that Helena could not bear children, and that the 3 sons she claimed to have given birth to had been bought from a slave trader who specialized in light-skinned children who could pass as white. The truth was shocking. The Whitmore sons were not Whitmores at all. They were the children of enslaved women, purchased as infants and raised as white gentlemen. Helena had kept this lie alive for more than 30 years, terrified that the truth would ruin her marriage and destroy her place in society. It was the deepest and most dangerous secret of her life, and now it belonged to Seraphina. She took the most important papers and hid them in a place outside the house she had already chosen during her nighttime explorations. When she was finished, she returned to the cellar and closed the door behind her. By the time morning came, she was back in familiar darkness. The chain was arranged around her ankle so it looked as if it had never been moved. No one suspected she had ever left. For the next 2 weeks, Serafina continued her nightly journeys through the house. Each night she grew stronger, forcing her body to move and stretch in the dark, rebuilding muscles that had weakened during years of captivity. She ate better now, quietly taking food from the kitchen after everyone slept. Color slowly returned to her skin. Her movements became smoother and more confident. She was preparing herself for what she knew must come. During the daytime, she listened. She learned that William had returned from Vicksburg with terrible news. The family's remaining property had been seized by Union forces. The New Orleans bank was demanding immediate payment of the colonel's gambling debts and threatening legal action if the money was not delivered. Creditors circled the family like vultures, sensing weakness where power once stood. Helena reacted by clinging harder to denial. She insisted they would recover, that the old order would return, that they only needed to endure a little longer. But her voice had changed. It sounded sharp, desperate, and fragile. Serafina recognized it easily. Helena was losing control. The world she had built on lies was collapsing, and she had no idea that the final blow would come from beneath her own feet. Serafina chose her moment with care. On a Sunday morning in mid-June, while the family sat at breakfast, she came up from the cellar for the last time. She had washed herself at the kitchen basin and dressed in clothes taken from a storage trunk. They were old and a bit too large, but they were clean. She brushed her hair and pinned it up simply. For the first time in nearly 6 years, she looked almost like a normal young woman. She entered the dining room without a sound. The family sat around the long mahogany table, picking at a thin breakfast of cornbread and weak coffee. Helena sat at one end, the colonel at the other. Thomas Jr. sat between them, staring down at his plate. None of them noticed her at first. Then Helena looked up and screamed. The sound that came from her throat was not human. It was the scream of someone seeing a ghost, of someone watching the dead rise before their eyes. She knocked over her chair as she stumbled back, pressing herself against the wall, her face pale with terror. The colonel stared at Serafina in confusion. He did not understand what he was seeing. He had never known about the girl in the cellar. Helena had hidden that secret from him just as carefully as all the others. To him, Serafina was simply a strange young black woman standing in his dining room. His first instinct was to call for help, to have her removed. But there was no one left to summon. "Good morning," Serafina said calmly. Her voice was clear and steady, stronger than it had ever been before. "I believe we have some things to talk about." Helena finally found her voice. "Get out," she hissed. "Get out of my house. I will have you whipped. I will have you killed. You will do nothing," Serafina interrupted gently. Beneath her soft tone was unbreakable strength. "You will sit down and listen, because there are things your husband needs to know." The colonel looked from Serafina to his wife, seeing the fear on Helena's face and not understanding why it was there. "What is this?" he demanded. "Helena, who is this woman?" "That," Serafina said, "is an excellent question. Why don't you tell him, Mrs. Whitmore? Tell him where I have been for the past 6 years. Tell him what you did to a 7-year-old child because you could not bear to see her face." And Helena told him. She told him about the cellar, the chain, the endless darkness. She told him about the hunger, the rats, the complete absence of human contact. Serafina spoke as well, describing it all clearly and without emotion, like testimony given in a courtroom. The colonel listened in horror. For all his faults, for all his part in slavery, he had never allowed cruelty like this. He believed himself to be a man of honor. The idea that his wife had locked a child away for years and slowly destroyed her with neglect was almost impossible for him to accept. Helena tried to deny it, calling Serafina a liar, a thief, an intruder. But her words rang hollow, especially after the terror she had shown moments earlier. When Serafina pulled folded papers from inside her dress, Helena's face drained of all color. "These are from your office," Serafina said. "The accounts you altered, the letters about the woman who died on the stairs. And this one is very important." She raised the letter from the doctor in Natchez. Helena rushed forward, trying to grab it, but Serafina stepped aside easily. Helena crashed into the table, sending plates and cups shattering across the floor. "Your sons," Serafina said, turning to the colonel. "They are not your sons. They are not your wife's sons. They were bought from a slave trader in 1829, 1831, and 1834. Light-skinned children who could pass as white. Your wife has lied to you for more than 30 years. The colonel stared at the letter, his face turning gray. Helena collapsed against the table, sobbing as her world finally fell apart. Thomas Jr. sat frozen, unable to move or speak. Everything he believed about himself, his family, and his place in the world shattered in minutes. He was not a Whitmore. He was not white. He was the child of an enslaved woman, bought and raised in a lie. The fall of the Whitmore family came quickly after that morning. Within hours, the colonel suffered a stroke. He lived, but his left side was paralyzed, and his speech was broken. He spent his remaining years in a wheelchair, cared for by servants who were now free and demanded wages the family could not afford. Helena was arrested 2 days later. Serafina had already sent copies of the strongest evidence to the Union commander in Vicksburg, along with a full account of her imprisonment. The authorities wanted an example of justice in the defeated South, and Helena Whitmore was the perfect one. She was tried by a military court and sentenced to 15 years in prison. She died of typhoid fever less than 2 years later. The 3 Whitmore sons scattered. William, the eldest, could not accept the truth. 3 weeks after the revelation, he put a pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Robert, the middle son, vanished and was never heard from again. Some said he went west to California. Others said he drank himself to death in New Orleans. Thomas Jr., the youngest, reacted differently, carrying the weight of the truth in silence as he disappeared into a world that no longer had a place for the name he once carried. Punctuation searched for Serafina after everything in his life had fallen apart and pleaded with her for any information about his real mother. She could tell him very little. The records were broken and incomplete, and after so many years the trail had gone cold. Still, she shared whatever she knew, and as she spoke, she saw something shift inside his eyes. In time he moved north to Philadelphia, where he lived as a black man for the rest of his life. He worked as a teacher in a school created for freedmen's children, giving them the education he himself had been denied. The Whitmore plantation was taken by the federal government and redistributed to formerly enslaved people under General Sherman's Special Field Orders No. 15. The large white house, once a powerful symbol of wealth and control, was divided into separate apartments for 3 black families. The wide cotton fields were broken apart and given out as small farming plots. The world that James and Helena Whitmore had built was not simply destroyed. It was reshaped into something they would never have imagined. It became a living community of free people working land they owned and building futures that truly belonged to them. And Serafina walked away. She left Warren County in the summer of 1865 and traveled north. She had no money, no belongings, and no family still alive. But she carried something far more important. She had survived. She had overcome. She had taken everything from the people who had tried to erase her existence. And she did it not with violence or bloodshed, but with truth. The secrets they had hidden so carefully became the very weapons that destroyed them. She traveled to Memphis, then to St. Louis, and later to Chicago. She worked wherever she could as a domestic helper, a seamstress, and a cook. She saved every coin with care, spending only what was needed to stay alive. During quiet moments, she taught herself how to read and write using newspapers and books she found thrown away in the homes where she worked. The same sharp mind that had kept her alive in the darkness, that had stored years of whispered conversations, easily learned the written word. By 1870, Serafina had saved enough money to open a small boarding house in Chicago's growing black neighborhood. She ran it for 23 years, offering clean beds and warm meals to black travelers who were refused service by white businesses. She never married and never had children. When people asked about her past, she simply said she had grown up in Mississippi and left after the war. She never spoke of the cellar. She never spoke of the Whitmores. That part of her life was sealed shut, yet she kept one object from those years. In a small wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom, she kept the chain that had been locked around her ankle for nearly 6 years. The iron was rusted, the links weakened by time, but it was still clearly what it had always been. Some nights, long after the house was quiet, she would take it out and hold it in her hands, feeling its heavy weight and remembering. She did not keep it out of emotion or longing. She kept it as a reminder of what human beings could do to one another, a reminder of what she had endured and survived, a reminder that no matter how deep the darkness became, there was always a path back to the light. Seraphina Drake died in Chicago on February 14, 1912. She was 60 years old. Her obituary in the Chicago Defender described her as a respected businesswoman and a strong pillar of her community. It mentioned her boarding house, her charity work with newly arrived migrants from the South, and her quiet strength and dignity. It did not mention Mississippi. It did not mention the Whitmores. It did not mention the cellar, but some people remembered. Old Bessie, who lived until 1889, told the story to her grandchildren before she passed away. Some of the formerly enslaved people who had worked on the Whitmore plantation whispered stories about the girl who came out of the darkness and destroyed her captors using nothing but truth. The story was passed down through generations, changing slowly as spoken stories do, until it became more legend than fact. And perhaps that is how it should be, because the story of Seraphina Drake is not only about one woman. It is the story of everyone who has been buried alive by injustice and still found the strength to rise. It is the story of secrets that oppressors try to bury and the truth that always finds a way to surface. It is the story of beauty that could not be destroyed, of a spirit that could not be broken, and of a vengeance that was patient and complete. Helena Whitmore tried to hide Seraphina in darkness because she could not stand to face her. She believed that by locking the girl away, she could pretend she did not exist. She believed that chains, stone walls, and years of isolation would destroy something she herself never possessed. She was wrong. The darkness did not break Seraphina. It shaped her. It made her sharper, stronger, and more patient than anyone could have expected. It taught her to listen while others spoke without care. It taught her to remember when others chose to forget. It taught her that cruelty is always built on secrets, and that secrets are the weakest foundation of all. In the end, Helena Whitmore was defeated not by force, but by truth, not by violence, but by patience, not by hatred, but by the unstoppable strength of a human being who refused to disappear. She spent years trying to hide Seraphina from the world. But the world always finds what is hidden, and sometimes what rises from the darkness is far stronger than what tried to bury it. This is the story of Seraphina Drake, the prisoner of beauty, the girl in the cellar, the woman who waited 10 years in darkness and came out carrying light for those who had wronged her. Her story was buried for more than a century, lost among the endless suffering of American slavery. But stories like hers always return. They rise through the cracks of history. They demand to be heard because truth cannot be chained forever. And beauty, true beauty, the beauty of the human spirit, can survive anything. Even 6 years of darkness, even a lifetime of injustice, even the cruelty of those who fear what they cannot control. Seraphina Drake learned this lesson in the cellar beneath the Whitmore mansion, in the endless blackness where she was meant to disappear. She carried that knowledge with her for the rest of her life, and now, more than 100 years after her death, her story continues to carry it forward. Some chains are made of iron, others are made of lies and secrets. Both can be broken. Both will be broken. It is only a matter of time, and Seraphina had all the time in the world.